I would sort of argue the same thing. They're about championing the public-private partnership, which inherently leads to, the private sector really dominating the public sector and making the public sector the enabling environment for the policy either the private sector or the oligarch, the billionaire, the Bill Gates type figure wants to implement at the end of the day. And there's actually a lot of UN documentation that refers to national governments as that, not as sovereign bodies, not as sovereign decision makers, but as enabling environments for policies made elsewhere. And I think that's how you see things like in the COVID-19 era, a lot of policies being globally implemented seemingly in lockstep. A lot of public policy is not made in Congress or in Parliament or whatever. It's made a lot of it's made by think tanks, many of them international think tanks, and they sort of get shopped around and implemented at the global level, and a lot of that is done by these networking organizations.
The people you elect aren't the ones in charge. Power now sits with billionaires who write the rules, fund the networks, and hand governments the script. That's the latest warning from investigative journalist Whitney Webb. Public-private partnerships often sound like teamwork, but in practice, they give the private sector control over public decisions. Governments become tools, not leaders, shaping policy around the interests of billionaires and big corporations. Whitney believes that during COVID-19, policies rolled out across countries with striking similarities. These weren't necessarily crafted by elected officials. They came from global think tanks, backed by powerful networks. What followed was a worldwide push of private agendas, delivered through governments acting more like messengers than decision makers. Make sure to stick around until the end of the video, as Whitney bravely exposes more of their hidden agenda. Now, let's hear from Whitney Webb.
A lot of the modern environmental movement, for example, has been developed by some of these people that overlap with groups like the UNEP, the environmental program, like Maurice Strong, for example, who was a career oilman, very attached to the Rockefeller family, themselves an oil baron dynasty, but also one of the longest financiers of eugenics, including the Nazi eugenics program. They financed eugenics for a very long time and have tried to finance it under different names. And ultimately, they've had an outsized influence, which is kind of ironic since they are big oil, on, the environmental thought. A lot of these people, the Rockefellers, for example, have financed to a significant degree, but also other people that are sort of of like mind. And the idea of this group, for example, the Club of Rome, that is very much interrelated with groups like the World Economic Forum. Developed this paper called Limits to Growth in the early 70s that was featured at, if not the first, the second World Economic Forum annual meeting. And, basically makes this argument that's similar to the Ehrlich's population bomb argument. But in a book they published, I think in the early 90s, they said that, we basically need to make the enemy of humanity man, like have people not like humanity itself and see them as the problem. And so what you bring up there about, decreasing sperm counts and infertility, a lot of this is due to chemical contamination, for example, among other environmental issues that are largely ignored today by the mainstream environmental movement, which focuses exclusively on carbon and not on, necessarily the carbon emissions of billionaires, but focuses on the carbon emissions of regular people, which I think is very telling. And there's it's kind of disconcerting to me that there's not really a lot of environmental movements really anymore around deforestation, ocean and riverway pollution, all the Superfund sites in the U.S. that are leaking all sort of toxic stuff into residential communities and also all over like military bases and veterans. There's no interest in any of this stuff from mainstream environmental organizations. It's all focused on carbon footprints and things like that. And the people that, created the global footprint, who now run this NGO called the Global Footprint Network, their board has a very extensive overlap with this previously mentioned Club of Rome group. And the Club of Rome comes out of this group called Adela that was previously, it was really about these Western oligarchs, mainly in Europe, but also to a lesser extent the United States, sort of going into Latin America and king-making their corporate landscapes, deciding who the winners and losers in the private sector in Latin America would become, and basically sort of incubating what are now the elite classes of Latin America. Interesting. So they're not, I would argue that they're, this group for a long time hasn't really been very environmentally motivated. They've had other motivations at play. And as it relates to the World Economic Forum, I would sort of argue the same thing. They're about championing the public-private partnership, which inherently leads to, the private sector really dominating the public sector and making the public sector the enabling environment for the policy either the private sector or the oligarch, the billionaire, the Bill Gates type figure wants to implement at the end of the day. And there's actually a lot of UN documentation that refers to national governments as that, not as sovereign bodies, not as sovereign decision makers, but as enabling environments for policies made elsewhere. And I think that's how you see things like in the COVID-19 era, a lot of policies being globally implemented seemingly in lockstep. A lot of public policy is not made in Congress or in Parliament or whatever. It's made a lot of it's made by think tanks, many of them international think tanks, and they sort of get shopped around and implemented at the global level, and a lot of that is done by these networking organizations like the WEF. I think a lot of people sort of got a cartoonish view of what the WEF functionally is during the COVID era. It doesn't help that Klaus Schwab kind of looks like a Bond supervillain, but a lot of people, called them communists and called them, all sorts of names, and I think, you really have to focus on what they are because they admit what they are. They're about promoting this vision of public-private partnership globally, ultimately a fusion of corporate and government power. It's really very close to the Mussolini definition of fascism at the end of the day. And, they've become very intertwined with groups like the UN. The UN Secretary General at the end of the 90s, Kofi Annan, said the UN has undergone a silent revolution, he said, where now the businesses of the world, their business is now the business of the UN. We're not really the meeting of public sector governments anymore. We're, basically announcing they're run by transnational capital now. So that kind of doesn't really grok with a lot of people's public perception about the United Nations. And I think people, should kind of scrutinize these particular groups. And I think a lot of the stuff to make people hate themselves and hate regular humans sort of plays very much into the hands of the elite as it relates to class war. Knowing there's plenty of anger at elites, but there's also a lot of self-blaming for stuff that regular people don't really have any control over at the end of the day. And a lot of things that are being marketed supposedly as sustainable development really aren't sustainable at all. The idea of moving all to electric vehicles and a lot of this digital transformation necessitates an insane amount of mining that will be hugely, and already is being, hugely environmentally destructive. And you don't really hear a peep about that from environmental groups. And inherently, even if every deposit of nickel, cobalt, lithium, rare earth minerals, if they're all mined all over the world, it is not enough to replace the number of cars in circulation today. So inherently, the freedom of movement would be inherently limited by this paradigm. And I don't necessarily think that fossil fuels or all of that are great either. But it's interesting too that a lot of the biggest promoters of these agendas now are actually big oil. Big oil is one of the biggest lobbyists today for carbon markets and for carbon quotas and a lot of these agendas that are being marketed as sustainable development. So the corporate world is very much in agreement that this is what they want, but how does that functionally translate into, what does that actually mean for people once it's implemented? Is it going to usher in, a world that actually is more environmentally sustainable? I would argue it won't, but it will definitely make the quality of life sustainable for billionaires, but will definitely not do that for regular people.
During the COVID era, big business took control of government policy. What used to be public decision-making now follows the plans of wealthy individuals and corporations. Klaus Schwab and groups like the World Economic Forum don't hide their goals. They support a system where corporate power blends with government authority. The United Nations has already changed. Whitney notes that its leadership admitted that global business now shapes its agenda. Policies sold as progress often cover up the damage they cause. Electric cars and digital programs rely on mining that destroys land and water, There isn't enough raw material to replace today's cars, yet the push continues. Oil companies now support carbon rules, not to reduce pollution, but to dominate the new system. The next step is harder to see. Technology will divide people into two groups. A small few will run the systems. Everyone else will be shaped by them without knowing how or why. Minds will be dulled, choices limited, and resistance will fade. This future is being built in plain sight, and it serves those at the top, not the people expected to live in it. Now, back to what Whitney has to say. But before that, today's video is brought to you by Crypto.com. If you still haven't got a crypto card yet, you're living in the past. Traditional cards have annual fees and transaction charges, but the Crypto.com Visa card doesn't. You can spend your crypto anywhere, and the benefits are amazing. With your Crypto.com Visa card, earn up to 5% back in CRO rewards on every transaction. Enjoy 100% cashback on Spotify, Netflix, and Amazon as a new customer for 6 months. Get complimentary access to airport lounges with a sleek metal card. Crypto.com is giving a $25 sign-up bonus for Jamie Tree viewers. Here's how to get your $25 bonus and start earning up to 5% back. Download the Crypto.com app via the first link in the description or scan the QR code on screen. Sign up using our referral code nutty for an instant $25 bonus. After approval, here's how to get your Crypto.com card. In the Crypto.com app, first tap the Card tab on the navigation panel. Select your card tier based on the required CRO staking amount. I have a Ruby Red card. You need to lock up 400 USD of CRO for 180 days, which is then unlocked. Accept terms and conditions and ensure you have sufficient CRO in your wallet for the stake period. Then, submit your delivery address. You'll then receive your Crypto.com Visa card, start making transactions, earning rewards, and enjoying the perks. To claim your $25 bonus and earn up to 5% back on transactions, click the first link in the description to get started with Crypto.com today. Now back to the video.
Some people, I'm surprised, some people are like, no, I just want the product. I just want the final product. I don't care about the backstory.
Yeah, a lot of people are like that. But I think those people may just already not really already have the atrophy of creativity that I just sort of mentioned. But ultimately, when you engage in a creative act, what are you filling up or fulfilling, or what muscle, as you put it, are you using? I would argue it's your soul, right? If you just have AI make it, the person that's making it doesn't get the same type of feeling they get if they actually engaged in the act of making art themselves or with another human. So if we let our souls atrophy because we're not doing anything that have been fulfilling to human souls for thousands of years, what does that ultimately mean? It's interesting in that same Schmidt-Kissinger book, they basically say that AI taking over will lead to one of two consequences. One of them is that the peasants rise up and overthrow the elite. That's one scenario, and probably not the scenario that Schmidt and Kissinger want. And then the second scenario is that AI spawns the creation of a new religion. So out of those two allegedly inevitable scenarios per those people, obviously I think it's quite clear, if you're familiar with the backgrounds of Schmidt and Kissinger, the outcome they want is that it creates a new religion. So we atrophy our souls and creativity in that spark that makes us human and outsource it to AI, and then it becomes a new religion. I mean, it's pretty crazy. It makes me think of the Greek myth of Narcissus, where he falls in love with his falls in love with his reflection, and I think it's that would definitely be a way that gets us to that post-human future, and it's something I think people should resist, because there's something important about humanity. There's obviously a reason that there's sort of this push to sort of snuff that out, and I think ultimately it leads to a world where humans are just easily controlled and essentially either harvested for data, harvested for energy, harvested for something, and not creators anymore. And it's up to anybody if they choose what path they choose to go down, whether they're going to go down the path of someone who creates and can manifest, and who can, actively do things and actively make decisions and have preferences and do these things that ultimately are part of what defines humans, right? Or if they're going to go down the path of, I'm going to be lazy essentially and let these machines do everything for me. But then you become either not necessarily even part of the machine. You end up, instead of the machine serving you, you end up serving the machine. And I think that's how we get to digital slavery quite fast if too many people take that path. So I think there's a lot of things people can do to resist these agendas, but I think that is a very easy and very important thing for people to do and consider.
Yeah, I like the dichotomy of what you said, where there's going to be the people that control AI, and then there's the people that are controlled by AI. And like, what is your approach to AI? Are you like, let's reject it all and live in a cabin in the woods, or are you like, we need to get ahead of this thing? Like, what's your philosophy?
Well, I have how I live personally. I personally don't use it at all. But I have a great assistant that helps run my website, and a huge part of my business, who's an amazing person, and she finds it very useful for certain tasks. And I'm certainly not going to judge someone for using artificial intelligence. But I think, again, it's that slippery slope thing. How far down if you don't use it, you lose it thing do you want to go? And obviously, I think there's ways to interact with AI where you're not really at risk of necessarily succumbing to that. But I think there are use cases where people may be. And it really ultimately depends into how connected you are, into how suggestible you are as it relates to your, your devices and your apps and things like that. So, I'm not really in the business of judging people or telling them how to live their lives. But, me personally, I just don't really have a place for it. I never plan to use it in my writing or for my research. As I mentioned much earlier in this podcast, I sort of started off doing, like farm stuff. I like being outside and not necessarily always in front of a screen. Obviously, doing a lot of writing and work over the past few years, I've been on screens a lot more than I definitely was in prior phases of my life. And I think at some point I'd like to get back to that. And I can't really think of anything personally in my life where I find AI very useful, but I know that's not the case for everyone, because not everyone has the lifestyle or career or preferences that I do, But I think, again, it's people need to have red lines about this type of stuff, and just be aware of the risks. And if there's skills you have that are important to you, do your best to, maintain them. If you want to use AI occasionally because you're in a pinch to generate something, that's not going to screw you over long term necessarily. But if you become reliant on it and that's all you use, and then after a year or something, yeah, you probably will see a difference. And, their vision, the Kissinger-Smith vision, is that this will happen on a society level, and that people will become, as they say, cognitively diminished. That does not sound positive. That does not sound good. So if you choose to use AI, I would urge you to make sure that you're not cognitively diminishing yourself, whatever that means for you.
The same forces driving digital control are now coming for the human spirit. Creativity, once seen as deeply personal, is being outsourced. Art made by machines may look convincing, but it carries no soul. People stop creating, not because they can't, but because they're told it's no longer necessary. When people stop using their imagination, stop engaging in the slow, messy process of making things, they become easier to steer. Even Schmidt and Kissinger, famous architects of this future, admit the outcome. In their own words, society will split. A small class will shape the world with AI. Everyone else will be shaped by it. The majority won't even realize what's happening. They call it cognitive diminishment, and it's absolutely worrisome. What begins as convenience ends as dependency. The more people lean on machines to think, the less they notice their thoughts becoming dull and their choices narrower. First, governments serve corporations, then humans serve the code. For a lot of us, that's not a future worth adapting to. Anyway, guys, before we go, if you want to stay most up to date on the crypto and Bitcoin world, subscribe to my daily 5-minute crypto newsletter. It's a concise resource for the latest expert predictions, breaking news, and top on-chain analysis, trusted by over 50,000 subscribers for insightful crypto investment information. Don't miss out on the opportunity to stay informed in the crypto market. The link is in the description below. I hope you all enjoyed today's video and that it gave you some value. I'll see you all at the next one. And as always, all the best.